biblical commandment. But I think Ephesians 6:11 through 12 also kind of drives home why, if we're talking to a person, we should be speaking the truth in love. And as we mentioned last week, it's that person is not our enemy. That person is not who we're really struggling against. Ephesians 6:11 through 12 says, "Put on the full armor of God so that you'll be able to stand firm against the schemes of the devil. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places." So again, our struggles against the devil. And a lot of people around us may be deceived. Depending on how deceived they are, that might even be leading them astray. And so that's who we're struggling against. It's not the person that may be disagreeing with us. It's just basically not people in general. So what we covered last week, and Jeff Denton, I don't know if anybody was at the late service, I thought he did a fantastic job on the communion remarks, but I think one of the points he made, it's our choice. We either choose to give our heart to God, or essentially, I'd say give it to Satan, but you could say keep it to ourselves. Well, it's our choice, and that's one of the choices that God gives us. But one of the things we started out last week is the fact that we can choose tells us how we should choose, because when you really get down to what the two alternatives are, well, the atheists, the evolutionists, they'll say, well, we're just all complicated chemical reactions. And so, you somehow life made itself, and then, that life somehow evolved into all the life we see around us. And, but you had, the sun, moon, stars, everything just kind of essentially made itself. Well, what we're talking about also is how, true science totally refutes all of that. But the main point here is, if that's really all there was, if that was the extent of the universe, we could not make even a simple choice. We would be just like a piece of wood burning in a fire, a complicated chemical reaction, but no more ability to choose anything, where we sat, what we got to drink before we came to class, did we come to this class? No ability to make even the simplest choice than that piece of wood would have how it's going to burn. And so I think, anybody remember that? Oh, good, had nodding back, so yeah, we're gonna keep going. Okay, great. Okay, now, so then you start into it. Well, 2,000 years ago, Romans 1:20, told us if we look at God's creation and we don't know something about God's eternal power and divine nature, it says we're without excuse. Well, that was 2,000 years ago. And if someone looked at God's creation and didn't recognize God, they were without excuse. Well, now our science, our understanding has advanced so much that we are, just incredibly without excuse. And I can't come up with the right adjectives, because we know so much about simplest life, say the simplest bacteria, any kind of life people could talk about, is vastly more complicated than anything people have ever made. We use the example that, it's more complicated than a laptop, more complicated than an airplane, more complicated than a rocket. So if someone says, and they'll use the 3.8 billion years to try to fuzz the thinking, but if someone says life just made itself, or life spontaneously arose, that's worse than saying this laptop spontaneously arose, or a rocket just spontaneously arose. It's just absurd given what we know about science. And so I do have some books up here. There's the one, Stairway to Life, that we talked about, that really drives home, gets into the biochemistry. But just the fact, I think the other example we use is just, if your child or grandchild comes home from school and says, oh yeah, the teacher taught us today that life made itself. Well, just go back and say, that's great. Can you make some in your lab tomorrow and bring it home for me? Because if something happens randomly, any junior high or high school lab should be able to do it on purpose. So it's taught as fact that it happened randomly. But it's not just, you can call any biotech company, you can call any university, try to, as politely as possible, ask them if they're willing to do that, and they'll hang up, or they'll say no, or they'll, because, but for whatever reason, we're in a society right now that's saying, oh yeah, it just happened randomly. Okay, so so that was another point. And then the whole idea, and we'll talk a lot about that today. We talked quite a bit about the information in the genome and the textbook examples for evolution, and went through, I think, peppered moths, which is a lot like Darwin's finches, went through bacteria resistance to antibiotics, went through new breeds of dogs and cats, all those that are sometimes given as examples for evolution. Actually, a couple of those are the textbook examples. Well, they either have nothing to do with evolution, or ironically, they show the opposite of evolution. And the reason is you have to look at the information in the genome. Evolution requires that bacteria, starting with this quote unquote simple life, that again is more complicated than a space shuttle. Starting with a simple life, somehow mutations and natural selection added all the genetic information for all the life we see around us today. Well, again, from our study in genetics, and there's a good book up here, it's the Genetic Entropy book. What we know from science today, that's again, it's going the opposite direction, and we'll talk about that a lot today, because you don't add genetic information with these mutations and natural selection. You're actually going the opposite direction. And so again, the textbook examples either show nothing, but the ironic ones are like, one of the major ways bacteria become resistant to antibiotics is because they lose genetic information. They lose the genetic information needed to absorb the antibiotic we're trying to design to use to treat it. And so it's a very serious problem, but it's got nothing to do with evolution. And in that case, it's actually the opposite. You have to worry that the bacteria will devolve so it can no longer be poisoned by the antibiotic that we developed. So it's kind of a strange way to think about it. It's one of those ones, very serious problem, but we have to really understand how it's happening. And the other two ways bacteria develop resistance to antibiotics is, nothing to do with evolution. The genetic information was always there. So anybody remember any of that? Okay, good. Awesome. Okay. And so, bottom line is, true science is the Christian's friend. So when we talk about the genome degrading, we did a couple examples last week, but this was a paper, it's about 9 years ago, and I'll just read the quote. It says, a new paper, Lynch 2016, written by a leading population geneticist, shows that human genetic degeneration is a very serious problem. He affirms that the human germline mutation rate is roughly 100 new mutations per person per generation, while the somatic mutation rate is roughly 3 new mutations per cell division. Okay, this is the sentence that is getting everybody's attention. Lynch estimates human fitness is declining 1 to 5% per generation, and he adds most mutations have minor effects, very few have lethal consequences, and even fewer are beneficial. And so that's becoming accepted, and it makes sense. When again I think we looked at mutating the manual for making a perfect car. You're not going to turn the car into a jet airplane. You keep mutating that manual, even with natural selection, it's declining. I'll give a. I won't go. I'll say the financial analogy if you guys start looking too bored, but because money always perks people up. But anyway, and so okay. Well, where are we going to go with this? Well, this is where there are going to be some serious societal consequences, because I don't know if anyone's ever known what you'd consider a fully consistent atheist. Okay, and I'm not sure I have either. But when you think about if it's really just purely focused on the physical, then a lot of the biblical commands don't make any sense. I mean, Luke 10:27, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And so I'd say probably one of the people I would consider the most consistent atheist. The reason I say consistent atheist, there's a lot of people out there that are just fantastic people. Your car breaks down at 2 a.m, they're the ones you're going to call to help you out, but they'll say they're an atheist. Okay, so what I'm saying is consistent atheist. And so he was very consistent because he'd worked it through, and he figured out, well, public education is just horrible. The child should have to, if you have like a 5-year-old and the parents wanted that 5-year-old to know how to read, well, they should have to like say, well, okay, we'll basically sell the child, you teach the child how to read and we'll give you like 30% of his gross earnings or something. It's almost like a business deal and stuff. Well, to him, it made total sense, and then, so compassion's bad, it's all survival of the fittest. Genetic screening before allowed to have children. Okay, now unfortunately that is happening, not directly, but pretty directly, and so we'll give examples of that. And then, again, if the person really believes that they're just a chemical reaction, that they have no soul, God has not given them a soul, and so therefore they can't make choices, well, then all of a sudden this societal screening, if you happen to be in charge of a country and your opposition's opposed to you, well, if it's just purely chemical, no free will, you can start having societal screening. Say, well, that family shouldn't be allowed to have children. And it sounds really weird, but as we'll talk about, it's actually happened in the past. That's Ecclesiastes 1:9. I think nothing new under the sun. Now we are all unique. 1 Corinthians 12:17 through 20. If the whole body were an eye, where would be the hearing? If the whole were hearing, where would be the smelling? But now God has set the members, each one of them, in the body just as he pleased. And if they're all one member, where would the body be? But now indeed there are many members, yet one body. And so again, we're all very unique. Now, the reason I say that is one of the more, I guess, publicized examples of, I guess, what you'd call eugenics, or really doing this genetic screening, is back in 2017, and the country of Iceland actually reported that it had eradicated Down syndrome. And so you read the headlines, and most of the newspapers, it was a very positive headline. They said, "Oh, Iceland has eradicated Down syndrome." And so you start thinking, "Wow, that's fantastic! They've cured Down syndrome." I mean, that was the first thing I jumped to, at least. Well, that's not what they said. They said they'd eradicated Down syndrome. And so what they'd literally been doing was they would do genetic testing of expectant mothers. And if they thought there was a reasonable chance that child was going to have Down syndrome, they were putting tremendous pressure on the mother to have an abortion, basically to kill the baby. And so apparently, at least, again, this was their release, they thought they had succeeded. And so they had eradicated Down syndrome. And so obviously that, in a good, generated a response in the U.S., and it actually is a really strong response. And so this was response to Denver Post. Denver Post published it. Said, "As the proud father of a wonderful 14-year-old son with Down syndrome, I was horrified at the news of a near eradication of children with Down syndrome in Iceland due to early identification procedures and early termination of pregnancies." Then it goes on and says, "It is clear that technology is ahead of understanding of the contributions that children with Down syndrome make to their families and to their communities. Studies show an extremely high happiness rate for families who have children with Down syndrome and also for persons with Down syndrome." So, really impressed that he wrote the letter. And unfortunately, these days, he probably got some hate mail in response. But you're really impressed with that. But then you start thinking, man, the fact that he had to write that, because you read that last sentence, and it's like, what if he said, yeah, my child has Down syndrome. He's kind of average. Does that mean the child shouldn't have been allowed to live? I mean, he's like going out of his way to say, hey, actually, we're happier than most of you guys, and he's happier than most of your kids. So it's kind of a strange spin that had to be taken. And so, but it went a lot further. So this was Frank Stevens. Now, his testimony, I think it's still available out on YouTube. It's a really, really powerful testimony. But he has Down syndrome, and he was testifying to a committee on this particular subject. And so I'll just read the quotes. But again, if you get a chance to go back and watch the YouTube video, it's a lot more powerful than me just reading it. But he says, starts out, a little bit of a joke, says, "Just so there's no confusion, let me say that I am not a research scientist. However, no one knows more about life with Down syndrome than I do. Whatever you learn today, please remember this. I am a man with Down syndrome, and my life is worth living." Goes on, says, "Sadly, across the world, a notion is being sold that maybe we don't need research concerning Down syndrome. Some people say prenatal screens will identify Down syndrome in the womb, and those pregnancies will just be terminated. It's hard for me to sit here and say those words." Okay, now if that isn't the understatement of the year, I don't know what is. I mean, so I'd be like, imagine being up here and saying, hey, I know I've got genetic differences with y'all, and I know a lot of people think I shouldn't be allowed to live, but trust me, I have a great life. I mean, that's just weird, but he's having to do this, and he did a great job. Says, "I completely understand that the people pushing this particular final solution are saying that people like me should not exist. That view is deeply prejudiced by an outdated idea of life with Down syndrome." And then he goes into seriously have a great life. Okay, so again, he's having to justify, it's just almost surreal, that he's having to give this kind of testimony. So he goes on, talks about all the, a lot of the good things he's gotten to do. And then in the middle here, and it's kind of bolded sentence, says, "Finally, we are the canary in the eugenics coal mine. We are giving the world a chance to think about the ethics of choosing which humans get a chance at life." And I think being empty nesters, we're all old enough. You remember the canary in the coal mine, and I guess the canaries are a little more susceptible to poisonous gases than the people were. So if the canary passes out, you need to leave the mine kind of quick. I mean, so it's and so that was but that's what he's saying is, okay, so you start out, you're trying to basically eradicate people with his genetic differences. Well, where does it stop? In other words, where do you, what if next year there's like, well, maybe these 10 differences in the following year, so maybe these 100 differences, or maybe these 1,000 differences. And so again, it's really powerful testimony. Now, again, mentioned nothing new under the sun. Well, this was from 1914. It was a civic biology. It was the most widely used U.S. biology textbook at the time. It was used for probably 20 years. Actually, I have a copy. You can still get them online. We got ours as Detroit Public Schools was using this particular book, and it was all under the guise of science. And so this is what they were basically saying, same topic, eugenics. Says, if such people were lower animals, we would probably kill them off to prevent them from spreading. Humanity will not allow this, and then it goes on. And then I like the the peer pressure at the end, it says, I don't like it, but it's interesting to note, remedies of this sort have been tried successfully in Europe and are now meeting with success in this country. Okay, so it's basically eugenics. Now, this is over 110 years ago. But see, now, unfortunately, we kill them off. It's just you kill them off in the womb because we have the technology to do the genetic testing. And so but again, it's the same basic, I guess you say just the same basic philosophy that's being done. And so, of course, what the Bible says about children, Psalm 127, 3-5. Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord. The fruit of the womb is a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. Happy is the man who has his quiver full of them. They shall not be ashamed, but shall speak with their enemies in the gate. And I should mention, along what the Bible says about children, we have one of the missionaries we support, and I won't name names, although he talks pretty freely about it. Well, he was living in a country where they were doing this a long time ago. It used to be, it became very simple to do this kind of genetic test with just a blood sample from the mother you could get, and before that it was amniocentesis. But anyway, so they thought, well, just given his age and some other things and his wife's age, that their child was going to be at risk of Down syndrome, and to the point where they started getting a huge amount of pressure to terminate the pregnancy, to kill the baby. And it's not, you think, well, what kind of pressure do you have? Well, it's like you have psychological. Well, you're being really selfish if you have this child. And then like almost threats, like, well, if you have this child, you're not getting any support from society. Country's not going to support you. You're not getting any welfare. Nothing to help. And so that kind of pressure. Well, of course, they didn't have the abortion, and now she's a very healthy 18-year-old. Okay, so it's so this isn't. Have some. Just I guess Madison congregation does have some direct experience related to this. Now, I think a lot of you have heard about Planned Parenthood. So just looking at some of Margaret Sanger, of course, founded that organization. She had some really extreme views, and you start thinking about, well, how could anyone say this? And the only way you can get my head around is, well, try to imagine that you don't believe in God. You don't believe God gave us a spirit. It's just evolution, or well, evolution's basically the explanation the atheists use. Well, if the folks are purely on the physical, this still doesn't make any sense. But for example, in Women in the New Race, she said, the most merciful thing that the large family does to one of its infant members is to kill it. And all these, I was like, nah, she didn't really say that. Well, you order the paper. Yeah, she did. And then you're like, why did I spend money ordering the paper? It's and then she had a plan for peace. And this is the one that I think drives a lot of people nuts too, is, what do these statements have to do with peace? Absolutely nothing. But so she had the birth control review, April 1932. Purpose of the American Baby Code shall be to provide for a better distribution of babies and to protect society against the propagation and increase of the unfit. No woman shall have the legal right to bear a child. No man shall have the right to become a father without a permit. No permit for parenthood shall be valid for more than one birth. And so, again, a lot of kind of extreme views. Now, this is mostly focused on eugenics, but there's been this historically a very strong tie between eugenics and racism and sexism. And so, for example, this was Charles Darwin, and of course it was I want to say it was his cousin, or that actually started eugenics in the 1880s. I think it was like Francis Galton or something. But this is Charles Darwin. So this is in his book Descent of Man. Says at some future period, not very distant. And I apologize in advance for these quotes because they're incredibly racist. But this is, and by the way, we know basically everything in that book is incorrect scientifically, but it had a huge influence, which we'll talk about in a minute. But also it, I'll just say had a very huge influence, even though it was completely wrong. So he says, at some future period, not very distant, as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. At the same time, the anthropomorphous apes will no doubt be exterminated. The break between man and his nearest allies will then be wider. Okay, here's the really, really racist part. For it will intervene between a man and a more civilized state, as we may hope, even in the Caucasian, and some ape as low as a baboon, instead of as now between the Negro or Australian and the gorilla. Okay, now you look at, and he sucks you into this. You read his book. He's very well written. He's very eloquent. He has a couple, 3 pages setting up his comments on racism, setting up his comments on, had to put the sexist comments in there too. Apologize. So, but he's, when you say, let's see, what did he say? Like the break between man and his nearest allies. I mean, this is before ChatGPT. I mean, that's a really eloquent way of phrasing something, even though it's completely evil, it's completely wrong. And then, of course, he being a white male, apparently he also had to spend even more time explaining how the average mental power in man must be above that of woman, and thus man has ultimately come superior to woman in poetry, strength, voice, etc. Now, what's also interesting, you think about, okay, how deceived is our society? Remember when we were doing the cancel culture? People were getting canceled. People, but you go into high school now, you say, hey, you ever heard of Charles Darwin? Oh, yeah, we've heard about him. Uh, they obviously hadn't really, and so how did he not get canceled? Again, technically incorrect. And, it's his book. Again, got a copy of it because I was like, wow, that's pretty extreme. But that's, so anyway, that led to Ernst Haeckel. These are even more racist. I won't bother reading them, but I just note that, he wrote a book, it called it The History of Creation. And so it's actually, basically it's an alternative to the book of Genesis. And again, the book is, he came up with a Monera, which didn't exist. He claimed he'd seen these simple cells, because again, this is where Louis Pasteur had done his experiments, and they were figuring out, well, no, there's no way life, life doesn't come from non-life. He was basically saying, oh no, there's real simple life. Turned out it was just amorphous gypsum precipitated out of seawater. Just put alcohol in seawater. So, but he thought, oh, he saw, I don't know what he thought actually. And then he had a lot of other fraudulent drawings, things like that. But these are even more racist in that he was saying that some dogs, basically saying some dogs are smarter than people, or races of people, as he would call it. And what's interesting is about the year 2020. No, I'm sorry, not 2020, 2000, about the year 2000, when there were all these big announcements that, hey, there's no such thing as racist. And that was actually a really, really good, important announcement. But, the Bible had been saying that all along. And they were just saying, well, our science has advanced so much that we know there's no such thing as racist. Okay, so what was the impact? Well, this is, getting back to that same book, 1914, taught us science. And so, when people say, well, why do the U.S. have such a problem with racism? Because actually, it's funny. You go to some countries, they'll literally say, oh, we've never had a problem with racism. And I'm not sure if they're right or not, but I believe them. So why did the U.S. have so much trouble with racism? Well, this was taught as science. Again, most popular science textbook, in the U.S., building on the teachings of Darwin, says at the present time there exist upon the earth 5 races or varieties of man, each very different from the other in instincts, social customs, and to an extent in structure. These are the Ethiopian or Negro type originating in Africa, the Malay or brown race from the islands of the Pacific, the American Indian, the Mongolian or yellow race, including the natives of China, Japan, the Eskimos, and finally, the highest type of all. Okay, so if you're sitting there and you're 9th grader and you hear that in your science class, hey, that's going to catch your attention. Because guess what? You're either the highest type of all or you're not, right? Well, either way, that's going to have an effect on you because you probably have a very credible science teacher that's saying, oh yeah, and this, this is well known over in Europe. We're building on these great, European, whatevers, and so that would have had an effect. And so I'm just wondering, a 15-year-old that heard that statement, well, when they're 65, and you start saying, why are you racist? And they're like, well, I don't know. Well, they kind of forgot, but that would kind of lay the foundation for that. And so again, had a, talk about societal effects, had a huge societal effect. And then, of course, Margaret Sanger, just kind of some more racist statements. And then, of course, where this is all going is, 1914, when that book was being used, this was before World War II. And then World War II, when you saw eugenics, you had said like Adolf Hitler convincing people that Jews hadn't evolved yet into being human. And so therefore, if you killed a Jew, it'd be like killing a rabbit. Things like that, well, they'd taken root. That's what we'd been teaching, and that's what had been being accepted. And so just 2 quotes again, Margaret Sanger, we should apply a stern and rigid policy of sterilization and segregation to that grade of population whose progeny is tainted or whose heritage is such that objectionable traits may be transmitted to offspring. And Adolf Hitler, nature does not wish that weaker individuals should mate with the stronger. She wishes even less that a superior race should intermingle with an inferior one, because in such cases all her efforts throughout hundreds of thousands of years to establish an evolutionary higher stage of being may thus be rendered futile. And so anyway, Ecclesiastes 1:9, it's basically says nothing new under the sun. Okay, so obviously what the Bible says about races, 2 of the best verses, I think Acts 17:26, and he has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on the face of the earth, and he's determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings, in Genesis 1:27. So God created in man his own image, in the image of God he created him. male and female, he created them. Okay, so so that was a real quick societal implications. I should mention, and I've got a copy of the magazine up here. If you go to the this month's edition of MIT's Technology Review, they actually talk about designer babies. They talk about groups that are claiming they can not just change the physical characteristics of your baby, they can help have certain temperaments. There's another group that says, well, what, and this is according to the article, it's a team of Stanford researchers that's saying, hey, we should, what if we just grow humans without brains so we can use them for spare body parts? Okay, this is becoming like the really bad science fiction movies that we all watched growing up. Well, this is actually, starting to come to fruition. So I brought the magazine with me if anybody wants to look at it afterwards. I was going to do a few slides on it, but I was like, nah, this is probably enough. So, okay. So anyway, all I would say is just be aware there's going to be huge societal implications for this because of what's happening. The genome is degrading, and our technology, which is to the point where now we can go in and we can change, individual letters on DNA. We can splice in DNA. I mean, we've been doing genetically modified organisms for a long time, but the technology is advancing very, very rapidly, and so so that's going to just end up with again a lot of societal implications. And they should got to I was down in Panama a couple weeks ago. Got to teach at a university, and they were asking what's about the ethical implications. And that was, so I'm always careful on that because another time I was down in Peru, and the school there is the main university for doing bioengineering in Peru, and they were pointing out, we think we can feed 3 times as many people if we do some genetically modifications to our crops. And so, hey, I can't say that's not. I mean, you know what I mean? It's your overall anxiety with the technology growing this fast, but there's also some really good applications for it. And so that's what makes it even more complicated because that's one of the countries they're having trouble feeding their population, and so you can't. So it's so anyway, I'll just kind of leave it at that. I will say fake science is often used to claim evil is good and good is evil. I think going back to the newspaper headlines where, oh, hey, we've eradicated Down syndrome, that was a classic example of that. And of course, that to me refers back to Isaiah 5:20 through 23. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and prudent in their own sight. Woe to men mighty at drinking wine. Woe to men valiant for mixing intoxicating drink, who justify the wicked for a bribe and take away justice from the righteous man. So that's what's great about the Bible. It's always, no matter what situation you're in, it applies. Some of these verses written 2,000-3,000 years ago, and they apply a lot of times even